the Baltic states have been very concerned about potential incursions from the Russians up in the sort of northern part of Europe into the Baltic states areas. At the same time, also, there's been some reports of exercises that have been carried out in the last sort of 12 months in that area, showing that if Russia did do an incursion into the Baltic states, it might well be successful. And I think that has caused a great deal of concern. So, Foreign Minister of Estonia has really been trying to make it absolutely clear, talking very directly to Moscow and the Russians, that whatever propaganda or disinformation might be spinning around about any Russian incursion into the Baltic states, it would likely be unsuccessful. And I think some of the exercises that are being quoted are from probably 12 months or so ago, and a lot's changed since then. It's very clear that the Baltic states, as the foreign minister has said, have been rearming, spending up to and beyond 5% of their gross domestic product on defence, and been doing an awful lot to strengthen the border between, well, Lithuania and Belarus, and then the other Baltic states with Russia. So I think it is just a real concern that as the Russians seem to be stalled in Ukraine and not going very far, the concern that they might try and attack through Belarus into Lithuania, or even into Estonia to the north. And I think a particular concern is Lithuania, because there is the Russian enclave of Kaliningrad, if you like, between on the Baltic Sea, with Lithuania between it and Belarus, the Slovakia Gap, which is an area of concern, and with the buildup of Russian forces. And only this week also we've heard the Belarusian leader and Belarusian politicians saying that Russia is now positioning more Russian nuclear missiles in Belarus. That the everything is quite aggressive, and I think the Baltic states are feeling particularly under pressure, and are very keen to show that actually they will be no pushover at all. And what he goes further to say is that if Russia did try and attack, the Baltic states and NATO would strike deep into Russia, hit. Yeah, presumably they're talking about using long-range missiles, long-range drones, which we've seen how effective Ukraine's been at doing this. But actually, NATO, with all the military resource it has, could inflict serious damage on Russia. So this is really trying to flex the NATO deterrence, in particular in the Baltic states, so that if Russia is thinking of any move up there, it thinks again. Well, I expect they'll have a variety of target sets. What has been very successful by Ukraine is been attacking the oil infrastructure of Russia. And that is the lifeblood. That is how Russia gets all its foreign currency. That's how it's financing its war machine. And Ukraine has managed to destroy 20 to 30% of that, having a massive effect. Those oil refineries and that infrastructure, deeper into Russia, is what is keeping Russia going at the moment. So I think the inference to that is that NATO has more long-range capabilities in this area, so would attack there. It's also pretty clear that NATO has the ability to attack Russian military bases deep into Russia. And what has happened in the period of the 4 years of the war so far is that a lot of Russian bases have had to be pushed further and further back from Ukraine and NATO boundaries, because they are in range of too many Ukrainian type attack drones and missiles. But NATO probably has the ability to go even further in there. So I think what Estonia is saying, and very much, what one is pretty certain that they're talking with a NATO mouth, as it were, that NATO has the capability and also the desire, if necessary, to attack deep targets. But I think we're talking about probably power infrastructure, as said, oil, probably the heating in Russia, but also military targets, which at the moment are probably beyond the range of what Ukraine could do, but NATO could very much do that. And I think it's also a very strong line to put off Russia potentially using any tactical or battlefield nuclear weapons that NATO would respond to anything with overwhelming conventional force, which it does have in some measure. Just one, for example, would be the F-35 stealth jets, and there are over 150 in NATO in Europe, in NATO countries, and these vastly overmatch anything that the Russians have. And if they were sent to fly into Russia to drop missiles and bombs on targets deep into Russia, they would probably be successful. Well, I think what NATO is trying to do is to make sure that Russia doesn't attack in the first place, so to prevent any response at all. And it's difficult to know what Russia could do in response. It's so heavily committed to Ukraine. We know that they've lost over 1.2 million soldiers thus far, and they can't replace the soldiers quickly enough. So they're very short of manpower. We know they've lost over 6,000 tanks. The Russian Air Force really has pretty much been devastated. We haven't really seen that. And the Russian Navy, yeah, in a similar fashion. Now, certainly Russia still is making long-range missiles. It talks a lot about its hypersonic missiles, but we've seen that Western air defense is more than a match for that. And of course, Western and NATO air defense is across NATO and not just being given to Ukraine to do that. I suppose the nightmare scenario and what is trying to be prevented is Russia going to tactical nuclear weapons. And that is a concern at the moment because there is certainly an imbalance. NATO European countries, well, the two nuclear countries are the UK and France, and it is only France that has battlefield nuclear weapons, and in no way at a scale that Russia has. So, in theory, Russia could use a battlefield nuclear weapon, and European NATO countries would find it very difficult to react to it. And I think it's no accident this week that countries such as Sweden and Poland have been talking about developing their own nuclear capability so that they could gain parity against the Russians here. And I think, whatever disagreements that European NATO countries are having with the US at the moment, if Russia did use a nuclear weapon, a battlefield nuclear weapon, I am sure that the Americans would support European NATO countries to respond with an overwhelming conventional response. And I think that is really at the heart of what the foreign minister of Estonia is saying here is, we have overwhelming power in NATO. First of all, don't even think about invading into the Baltics. And if you do invade, expect to be absolutely hammered and don't even think about going for your tactical nuclear red button. Well, I think most commentators would say we are already in a pre-war period, or we're certainly in the period between peace and war, without wanting to, over-conflate it. And we're in a preparatory phase. It has always been the norm is the best way to prevent war is to prepare for it. And I think NATO has been guilty of forgetting about war. After the end of the Cold War, we've so overspent the peace dividend that we're now in a rapid catch-up. And Russia presumably decided to invade Ukraine 4 years ago because it thought that Europe and NATO was just not interested, didn't care, because we'd spent so little on our defense to get it into a position where it was a credible conventional deterrence. So absolutely, we're in a pre-war phase. And it's essential that NATO does rearm, shows very strong conventional deterrence to prevent the pre-war turning into an actual war, which certainly I think nobody in the world wants. And I'm pretty sure the Russians don't want either, because whatever bravado comes out of Moscow and the Kremlin from the propagandists, I think most people in Russia realize that this war in Ukraine has been a massive mistake. They've suffered, as I've already said, well over 1 million casualties. The economy has been trashed, and Russians are suffering badly themselves. So what we need to assure is that Putin realizes that war is absolutely the last thing that he should get involved in, because it's likely that as NATO powers up and rebuilds, it would prevail against Russia. And if Russia loses, that is the end of Putin.